Welcome to episode 45 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And today I'm going to talk about NoMeansNo's debut album, Mama, which came out at the very end of 1981. It was self-produced, and there are only, I think, 500 copies of the original run. They eventually lost the tapes. There was a subsequent reissue on cassette, but there are only 500 of these. I was extraordinarily lucky basically to come across this one because they are hard to find and they're pricey. I got this and a lot of records for which I paid something like $20 at auction. Needless to say, this single album is worth it, which is in great condition. So again, thankfully, is significantly more valuable than that. So No Means No. Two brothers, Rob Wright, John Wright. Rob's significantly older. They grow up in Victoria. Rob goes off to university, learns how to play bass and guitar, comes back to Victoria. His brother John, at that point, is finishing up high school, can drum, plays piano. They gigged around Victoria as a duo, basically with bass and drums. They'd heard DOA play, they'd heard other punk bands play, and they got turned on to that. But unusually, they were not playing three-chord thrash guitar, which was kind of, the hallmark of and was and still is in some respects the hallmark of punk rock. So this is punk without guitar for the most part. There's a little bit of guitar here and there, but it is still punk as fuck, as they say. When you listen to this, I think the influences on this band, given the time they were producing it, this album, are plain as day. And I hear Joy Division, I hear Public Image Limited, I hear the Violent Femmes, I hear Frank Zappa. I certainly hear the sound of musicians who had been exposed to a lot of contemporary jazz and were not afraid to explore what their choice of instrumentation might mean for the music they were trying to play. It's lyrically, I think, brilliant. It's not always necessarily lyrically very clear, but it's lyrically very brilliant and daring in what is, or certainly was in the 1970s, one of Canada's stodgiest and most conservative white bread communities. There is a total lack of fear of diving into kind of the furthest recesses of the mind, of sexual identity, sexuality, come what may. It's a very lyrically courageous album too. There are records that sound a lot more punk rock, but which are not nearly as punk rock as this album. Like, for example, anything by Black Flag after Henry Rollins joins with this kind of macho thing. If you think of punk as sort of rejecting, overproduction and exploring actually important, gritty, personal themes, and rejecting social control over the individual, this is as punk as it gets, and it's truly amazing. So in terms of the music on the record, you instantly get into what these guys are about. For the most part, this whole album is essentially bass on melody and drums as percussion. You occasionally get Rob either doubling the bass or providing a little bit of extra melody on guitar, but for the most part the bass is completely driving this. Occasionally John Wright will add some piano. For the most part, you're dealing with drums and bass all the way through. That's true of Living is Free, which starts off as really sort of intricate bass lick, and you get the guitar, little wimpy guitar in the background doubling it, but it's totally a bass-driven song. By the way, this is produced at kind of a low-rent studio in Victoria, and I think at least one of the songs was actually from their basement demos. So yeah, you could tell that this is not produced at the Hit Factory or Abbey Road, but nonetheless, given the resources they had, it sounds amazing. So that's a great start. Followed by My Roommate's Turning Into a Monster, which is I have to think of some kind of autobiographical description of having a creepy AF roommate. When I listen to it again, with a kind of a critical ear, as opposed to just for fun, you really begin to appreciate what a great bass player Rob Wright is. So many different sound flavors just with electric bass. And very, very minimal effects too. It's really quite impressive. Next song is Red Devil. Not sure what this is about other than damnation and sex, so I guess it comes from the noble tradition of rock and roll, I suppose. Mama's Little Boy has got some great drumming by John. It has obscure-ish lyrics, although there is a bit of an incesty theme, which I guess is what makes me think of the Violent Femmes. Wonderful bass work again on this song. Then we get to the outside, side 2, and that starts with We Are the Chopped. This has probably the best bass riff on the whole album, on an album full of great bass riffs. It's a 4/4 song, but you actually kind of have to remind yourself as you're thinking about it because of the complex way, well, the riff is designed and the way they do variations on it. So again, musically, this is in no way an amateurish performance. Piano shows up here, and as I mentioned before, it's kind of a percussive instrument as much as anything else. Then we have No Sex, which is an awesome, funky song. The best song on the album, certainly so far as I'm re-listening through it. Lyrically, pretty clearly about the arbitrary nature of sexual identity, and just shows again, I mean, again, this is 1981, how far ahead these guys were in terms of anticipating musical themes which would only become mainstream maybe 30, 40 years later. So that's really striking. This is a 1981 song. Then Rich Guns, which is, as far as I can tell, about American imperialism in Latin America and elsewhere. The message is basically, you know, fuck those imperialist rapists, which I guess is a message we should be able to get behind. Playing is really, really tight, and again, this is complex music. You know, this is music just to blow away the sort of 3-chord punk set when it first came out. Second last song on the album is No Rest for the Wicked. I don't know what it's about. I don't think it matters. It's super high tempo. It's you know fast, accurate, tight playing. It's got this crescendo at the end, which is really wild. Anyway, great song there. The last song is Living in Détente, which is the only song which came from their original Basement demos and wasn't re-recorded in the studio. Détente, of course, for those of you who aren't Cold War aficionados, was the period of a slackening of tensions, a negotiated slackening of tensions between the Americans and the Soviets in the 1970s during the Cold War. It was kind of a weird time because the Cold War and the rhetoric of the Cold War was still alive, and yet there had been a recession of overt tension. There were increased cultural exchanges, there were hockey tournaments going on, and so on, and yet fundamentally the mistrust and most importantly the nuclear arsenals pointed at each other was still there, patently there. And so it's an uneasy decade, an uneasy period of time politically, and that's reflected very much in the lyrics here. This is also a song where piano and other keyboards are much more central than they typically are in the rest of the album. So it's an interesting, more political than most of the songs way to end out the album. So I give this album 4.5 out of 5. This has tons of influences which you can clearly identify when you hear the album, and yet it is something that we've never heard before. It is a punk album unlike almost any punk album you can find, and it comes out of what was certainly at that point, although there was to be a burgeoning and very significant punk scene in BC in the years to follow, comes out of what was at that time a total backwater musically, both in terms of music overall and in terms of punk rock in Victoria, BC. It's punk like you've never heard it before if you've never heard this album. Totally influential, much sought after, fantastic record. Give it a listen.